At 4:47 a.m. on March 14, 1942, Private First Class Aurelio Rello Di Malanta of the 2nd Regular Division, Philippine Army, lay prone inside a hand-dug lateral tunnel no wider than a man's shoulders, positioned beneath the eastern slope of Hill 522 on the Bataan Peninsula, with 43 Japanese soldiers of the 65th Brigade massing on the surface no more than 60 meters away, and a dense curtain of morning fog pressing down over the Kogon grass like a wet woolen blanket pulled tight across the earth. The weapon he cradled was not a rifle, not a bayonet, not anything found in the Philippine Army's official armory. It was a modified bamboo fire bellows fitted with a percussion cap firing assembly, capable of discharging a packed load of crushed stone, broken glass, and cast iron scrap through a clay-hardened bamboo tube at lethal range. An improvised shotgun his officers had laughed at and called a baril bata, a child's toy gun. His nearest Allied support, a 4-man rifle team under Corporal Ernesto Nacion, was positioned 110 meters uphill behind a hasty fighting berm, separated from Di Malanta by the full width of the Japanese advance corridor. In the next 40 seconds, the Japanese flanking element would step directly over the concealed tunnel vent, and Di Malanta's device, ridiculed at every briefing, confiscated once and returned only under protest, would either work or he would die in the dark with it in his hands. In the mountains of Bataan, where ammunition ran short and factory weapons ran out, it was not rank that decided who lived and who taught the enemy fear. It was the man who understood his ground well enough to fight from inside it. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. The morning of March 14, 1942, would not make the front pages. No war correspondent was on Hill 522. No official after-action report would record what Aurelio Di Malanta did in that tunnel before sunrise. What survives instead are the testimonies of the men who were there. The oral histories gathered by Provincial Veterans Affairs officers in the 1960s, a single typewritten incident log held in a faded folder at the National Historical Commission in Manila, and the memory of a hill where the Japanese, for reasons that took them hours to understand, stopped advancing for an entire morning. That memory is what this account reconstructs, as faithfully as the fragmentary record allows. Di Malanta had been called a fool. He had been called insubordinate. He had been told, more than once and by men with more stars than sense, that his tunnel and bellows system was a waste of manpower, and that he should pick up a proper rifle and soldier like everyone else. He did not argue. He dug. What he built beneath Hill 522 was not a weapon so much as a doctrine, the doctrine of the man who has nothing, who uses the ground itself as his arsenal, who understands that the enemy's greatest vulnerability is the thing he cannot see. When the Japanese crossed the surface of that hill in the pre-dawn fog, they had no idea that the ground beneath their boots was listening. Aurelio Di Malanta was 24 years old in March 1942. He was born in Lubao, Pampanga, the 4th son of a tenant farmer who worked the rice paddies of the central Luzon plain. He had attended barrio school through the 5th grade, left to work alongside his father, and at 19, had enlisted in the Philippine Army Reserves during one of the mobilization drives of the late 1930s. When the Japanese invaded in December 1941, he was called to active service as a private first class, a designation that meant little beyond the fact that he had served long enough to be trusted with a weapon. He was not physically imposing. At 5 feet 4 inches and perhaps 130 pounds, he was unremarkable in a uniform that never quite fit him. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Renato Bautista, recalled him in a 1963 oral history interview as quiet, always digging something, always measuring things with his hands. Other men in the platoon found him odd. He spent his rest hours not sleeping but crawling along the hillside terrain, pressing his ear to the ground, tapping rocks with his knuckles, probing the soil with a sharpened stick. To his platoon, this was eccentricity. To Di Malanta, it was reconnaissance. What Di Malanta had that his officers lacked was a cultivated sensitivity to landscape. He had spent his childhood in the fields, not simply working them but studying them. He knew how flood water moved through loam, how root systems created hidden voids beneath the surface, how sound traveled differently through wet clay than through dry laterite. When the Philippine Army retreated to Bataan in January 1942 and began building defensive positions across the peninsula's mountainous spine, Dimalanta looked at the terrain and saw something none of his officers articulated in their briefings. The ground was full of usable space. The hills of Bataan were laced with soft volcanic soil overlying fractured limestone, soil that yielded easily to a determined excavator, that held its shape when reinforced with bamboo, and that sat above the enemy's line of sight. He began digging his first lateral tunnel in late January, without orders. When Lieutenant Bautista discovered it, he ordered Dimalanta to stop wasting time and fill the hole back in. Dimalanta filled in half of it and dug a second entrance elsewhere. When Bautista discovered the bellows weapon, the result of 2 weeks of patient construction from materials scrounged from an abandoned farmhouse, he confiscated it and told Dimalanta that the Philippine Army fought with rifles. Corporal Nacion, who had observed Dimalanta's work with quiet admiration, retrieved the device 3 days later and returned it without comment. No one asked questions. On Hill 522, in the cold hours before March 14, 1942, that silent act of solidarity would matter enormously. The Battle of Bataan by March 1942 had entered its most desperate phase. The combined Filipino-American force under General Edward King had been penned onto the Bataan Peninsula since early January, cut off from resupply by Japanese naval supremacy in Manila Bay and from reinforcement by a strategic decision made in Washington that prioritized other theaters. The men on Bataan were fighting on half rations, then quarter rations, then less. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever moved through the defensive lines with the same quiet efficiency as enemy infiltrators. By mid-February, the Second Corps' main line of resistance along the Pilar-Bagok Road had been hammered repeatedly by General Masaharu Hama's 14th Army, and the defenders had pulled back to a final defensive line anchored on the rugged terrain south of that road. The Japanese tactical playbook in Bataan was sophisticated and well-practiced. The 65th Brigade, which operated in the eastern sector where Dimalanta's unit was positioned, had developed a particular method for reducing the Filipino-American defensive positions on the peninsula's hills. They would identify a defended hill through artillery observation, soften it with mortar and field gun fire, and then advance in 2 coordinated elements: a direct frontal assault along the visible approach axis designed to draw fire and fix defenders in place, and a flanking infiltration element that moved through the jungle and kogon grass to strike the hill's exposed sides or rear. The flanking element moved at night or in pre-dawn darkness, using the terrain and the defender's forward-facing posture to achieve surprise. This was precisely the maneuver being executed against Hill 522 on the night of March 13-14. Filipino scouts had confirmed that a Japanese column of approximately 40 to 50 men had moved into position in the ravine east of Hill 522. During the afternoon of March 13, expected to move at first light along the eastern slope to strike the platoon's rear. The Filipino-American command response was conventional and, by the standards of their resources, reasonable. Corporal Nacion's rifle team was positioned on the uphill berm. Sergeant Domingo Reyes led a 6-man blocking element to the north. Artillery support was theoretically available from Second Corps Reserve, but communications had been unreliable for days. In practical terms, the defenders of Hill 522 on the morning of March 14 were what they had been for weeks, on their own. What the command plan did not account for, could not account for, because no officer had walked the eastern slope of Hill 522 the way Dimalanta had, was the terrain feature that Dimalanta had identified 6 weeks earlier and spent 37 days exploiting. Approximately 60 meters below the summit on the eastern face of the hill, a natural depression in the laterite soil sat beneath a shelf of overhanging rock. Beneath that depression, the volcanic subsoil gave way to a layer of fractured limestone that had been partially eroded by centuries of rainwater movement. Dimalanta had found this void by pressing his ear to the ground and tapping. He had spent the following 5 weeks expanding it by hand, using a sharpened mahogany stake as his only digging tool, removing loose material in a cloth sack and scattering it each night down the hillside, where it would not be visible. By early March, he had a lateral tunnel approximately 8 meters long, just wide enough for a man to lie prone, with 2 concealed vent openings in the hillside approximately 4 meters apart. The vent openings, covered with a lattice of bamboo slats and a thin layer of pressed kogon grass, were invisible from the surface at more than 2 meters distance and utterly invisible in pre-dawn fog. The Japanese flanking element, moving up the eastern slope in the dark, would pass directly over this tunnel. They would pass close enough that Demalanta could hear their footsteps through the soil. They would be within the effective range of his bamboo weapon before any of them knew he was there. Command had not authorized this position. Command did not know about this position. When Demalanta had attempted, 3 weeks earlier, to brief Lieutenant Bautista on his tunnel system and the tactical use he envisioned for it, Bautista had cut him off with a wave. "Demalanta, you are a private, not an engineer. Get back in your fighting position." Demalanta had returned to his fighting position. At 11:30 p.m. on March 13, while his platoon settled into the night watch, he quietly took his bamboo weapon, his cloth bag of improvised ammunition, a mixture of crushed gravel, broken pottery shards, and flattened cast-iron bolt ends salvaged from a destroyed vehicle, and crawled into the eastern slope of Hill 522 and disappeared into the ground. The weeks preceding March 14 had been a sustained education in institutional resistance. Demalanta was not the only Filipino soldier who had improvised in Bataan. The peninsula's defenders were masters of improvisation by necessity, fashioning everything from foot wrappings to water filtration systems out of whatever the jungle and abandoned farms could provide. But most improvisation was tolerated because it was invisible. A man who fashioned sandals from tire rubber drew no attention. A man who spent his working hours digging unauthorized tunnels and constructing weapons out of farm equipment was another matter entirely. After Bautista confiscated the bellows weapon in February, Demalanta had rebuilt it. The second version was more refined than the first. The barrel was a length of mature bamboo, wall thickness of nearly 2 centimeters, hardened by charring and sealed at the breech with a clay and resin plug. The firing mechanism was a modified percussion cap assembly stripped from a damaged rifle, the only component of modern manufacture in the entire device. Demalanta had drilled the bamboo barrel to accept the cap nipple with a tool he fashioned from a hardened nail. The bellows, actually a dual-action compression chamber, was constructed from layered cattle hide over a bamboo frame, capable of generating sufficient blast pressure to launch the packed charge of scrap material down the barrel, with lethal force at ranges up to 15 meters. Beyond 15 meters, the spread pattern of the improvised shot was wide enough to wound but unreliable for killing. Within 10 meters, Demalanta knew from his own testing, it was devastating. He had tested it twice at night, at the bottom of a ravine where the sound would not carry to the Japanese positions. The results had satisfied him. They did not satisfy anyone else, because he had not told anyone about the tests. The morale situation in his platoon was deteriorating in ways that made his officers short-tempered and dismissive. Rations had been cut to 2 small meals per day. 3 men in the platoon had malaria and were fighting on quinine they could not reliably obtain. Word had reached the line that General MacArthur had departed the Philippines for Australia on March 11, 3 days before. Demalanta lay down in his tunnel, and the emotional effect of that departure on Filipino soldiers who had grown up watching MacArthur presented as the peninsula's protector was difficult to overstate. Morale was not simply low. It was being actively managed by officers who were themselves frightened and who dealt with their fear partly by imposing rigid discipline and rejecting anything that smelled of desperation or improvisation. Demalanta understood this. He did not argue, did not appeal, did not attempt another formal briefing. He worked in silence. Corporal Nacion brought him extra gravel from the dry stream on the hill's north side. Private Rodrigo Malari, who slept nearest to Demalanta in their shared fighting position, pretended not to notice the cloth sacks of displaced earth that appeared each morning. Small, silent solidarity, the kind that does not appear in any record but that holds units together when commands have failed. On March 12, the Japanese conducted a probing attack on Hill 522's northern face that was repelled with significant difficulty after nearly 2 hours of close fighting. Sergeant Reyes' blocking element lost 1 man killed and 2 wounded. The platoon's remaining rifle ammunition was redistributed from a dwindling pool. That evening, Lieutenant Bautista gathered his NCOs and told them flatly that if the Japanese hit them again in the same strength, the position might not hold. He said nothing about Demalanta. Demolanta said nothing about his tunnel. At 11:30 p.m. the following night he went into the ground. At approximately 3 a.m. on March 14, Demolanta heard the Japanese flanking element begin to move. He heard them first not with his ears but through the soil, a subtle change in the ground's tremor, the kind of vibration that a man who has pressed his ear to the earth for 6 weeks learns to distinguish from wind movement and animal passage. He lay still, controlling his breathing, and listened. They were moving carefully. He could tell from the rhythm of the footsteps, measured, deliberate, spaced, that these were experienced soldiers exercising proper noise discipline. They were moving uphill in a loose column, using the natural shadow of the rock shelf above him as concealment from the Filipino positions at the summit. They were doing exactly what the Filipino scouts had predicted, which meant they were doing exactly what Demolanta had spent 5 weeks preparing for. He had no communication with Corporal Nassan's team uphill, no radio, no signal cord, no pre-arranged acoustic signal, nothing that would not risk compromising his position. He was operating in complete isolation, by design and by necessity. Everything that would happen in the next 30 minutes would be his decision alone, executed with a weapon no one believed in a hole no one knew existed, against an enemy 43 strong. He prepared the weapon with movements so rehearsed they required no thought. He unpacked the cloth bag and loaded the bamboo barrel, packed first with a wad of dampened plant fiber as a gas seal, then with the scrap charge, then with a second fiber wad to hold the load in place. He primed the percussion cap assembly. He positioned himself at the forward vent opening, lying on his left side with the weapon canted at a shallow upward angle, the muzzle protruding just far enough through the bamboo lattice to clear the kogon grass cover. He waited. The footsteps reached the shelf. He could hear them directly above him now, not a tremor but an actual sound, the soft compression of boots on earth. He counted silently. 1, 2, 3, 4 passes of sound over the forward vent. He waited. He had designed the tunnel's position so that both vent openings fell within the corridor the flanking element would use. He needed them clustered. He needed them past the first vent and bunched above the second, the position where the natural terrain would funnel them slightly toward each other, where the rock shelf's overhang forced them inward by 2 or 3 meters. He heard them slow. Above the second vent, the slope leveled briefly before resuming its incline, a small flat shelf of perhaps 4 meters. Invisible from the summit, the kind of terrain feature that an advancing column naturally pauses on to close intervals and re-establish formation before the final uphill push. He had known about this feature since February. He had planned for it. He did not wait for the last man to reach the shelf. He waited until the ambient sound above him reached its maximum density, the moment when the most soldiers were positioned over the minimum area, in the silence between his own heartbeats, listening through 6 inches of volcanic soil to the boots of 43 men. He made the judgment that 5 weeks of preparation had given him the right to make. He fired. The sound of the bellows weapon discharging inside the tunnel was enormous, a compressed booming crack that bore no resemblance to a rifle shot, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that one survivor of the Japanese flanking element would later describe to a Filipino interpreter as like the earth itself firing a gun. The charge, crushed gravel, pottery shards, cast iron bolt heads, erupted from the forward vent in a tight dispersal cone that spread to approximately 1 meter width at the surface, which was close enough to the boot level of the soldiers above to catch 4 men across the lower legs and feet simultaneously. The screaming started before Demolanta had finished reloading. He worked with practiced speed, loading the second charge, a slightly heavier pack, because the second vent was 4 meters farther and he needed the energy, while above him the Japanese column broke its noise discipline entirely. He could hear voices, sharp and urgent. He could hear the sound of men dropping to the ground, the crack of a rifle fired reflexively at nothing, the thud of bodies pressing flat against the hillside. He could hear the specific high-pitched quality of pain in 2 of the voices, and the confusion in the others, the rapid staccato Japanese commands that he could not understand linguistically but that he understood operationally. They were trying to identify where the fire had come from. They were looking outward, away from the hill. They were looking for a shooter in the jungle below. He fired the second charge. The second shot came from a position 4 meters lateral to the first, from an opening the Japanese had not identified and were not looking toward. The dispersal pattern caught the portion of the column that had instinctively pressed uphill toward the rock shelf. The soldiers who had moved away from the direction they assumed the first shot had come from, moving directly over the second vent in the process. 3 more men went down. One was struck in the face, the screaming intensified. Above him, the Japanese column fractured. He could hear it fracture, the cohesion of 43 disciplined soldiers dissolving in real time, the shouted commands multiplying and contradicting each other, the sound of men running in different directions. Some ran uphill, back the way they had come. Some pressed flat against the rock shelf. Some ran laterally across the slope and collided with the kogan grass, which slowed them and made them more noise than less. The flanking maneuver, timed, coordinated, designed to hit the Filipino rear at first light, had stopped. Dimolanta reloaded a third time. He did not fire the third charge immediately. He waited, listening. The distribution of sound above him had changed. The men who had run uphill were gone. He could no longer track their footfalls through the soil. The men who had pressed flat were holding still, which meant they were either trying to locate him or trying to decide whether to retreat. The man who had been struck in the face had stopped screaming, which meant either that he had been carried away or that he had lost consciousness. Dimolanta held the third charge and waited. On the hilltop above, Corporal Nacion's rifle team had heard the first explosion and identified it correctly as something happening below and to the east. They had not heard a Japanese rifle fire in response, which told them the Japanese flanking element had not reached the Filipino defensive line. Nacion, a practical soldier, had made the decision to hold his position rather than move toward the unknown sound. That decision kept his men from walking into a disorganized Japanese formation in the pre-dawn fog. It was, in retrospect, the correct decision, though Nacion would later say he made it primarily because he had no idea what was happening and thought movement would make things worse. What was happening was Dimolanta, in total darkness, 6 inches below the surface of the hill, loading his bamboo weapon for the third time and listening to the Japanese decide what to do. They decided to retreat. He heard it before he could be certain of it, the gradual migration of footfall sound back down the slope, the decrease in ambient noise above the tunnel, the cessation of shouted commands. One by one, then in groups, the remaining soldiers of the flanking element moved back down the eastern face of Hill 522. They moved faster than they had come up, abandoning the measured spacing of their infiltration approach, several of them breaking into a near run across the lower slope. They left behind, based on what Filipino scouts would find at first light, 3 dead men and the equipment that the wounded had been unable to carry. Dimolanta lay in the tunnel for 20 more minutes after the last footstep sound had faded. He was not being cautious. He was being certain. He had been in the ground for 4.5 hours, and he understood the ground well enough to know that what felt like silence and what actually was silence were different things. When he finally crawled out, the fog was beginning to thin at the edges, and the first gray light was touching the summit of Hill 522. He emerged from the tunnel vent with his bellows weapon, his cloth bag, and 4 unexpended charges. He climbed the slope and found Corporal Nacion at the berm, watching the eastern approach with tight-shouldered vigilance. Nacion looked at him for a moment, then he looked at the bamboo weapon, then back at Dimolanta. "Ikaw ba yun?" he said. "Was that you?" Dimolanta said yes. Nacion was quiet for another moment. Then he said very simply, "It worked." Below the hill, the Japanese 65th Brigade's eastern flanking element was regrouping at the base of the slope. Their element commander, attempting to reconstruct what had happened, was reporting to his superior officer that the Filipino position on the hill's eastern slope was defended by some type of fixed crew-served weapon positioned in concealed emplacements, probably a modified light mortar or a dual-position machine gun, and that the advance could not continue until those positions were identified and suppressed. The report would delay the next Japanese attack on Hill 522 by nearly 6 hours, while Japanese artillery observers attempted to locate weapons that did not, in any conventional sense, exist. Sergeant Reyes, arriving at the berm with his blocking element when the fog lifted, looked at the evidence. The 3 bodies at the base of the slope, the blood trails on the kogan grass, the undisturbed surface of the hill's eastern face, and arrived at the same conclusion as the Japanese. Something had hit them from multiple fixed positions. He did not immediately connect the evidence to Dimalanta's tunnel, because Dimalanta had not told him about the tunnel. When he found out, he said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he said, "Next time, tell me before you go underground, so I know you're not dead." Lieutenant Bautista was told about the tunnel and the bellows weapon on the morning of March 14, approximately 2 hours after Dimalanta emerged. The briefing was given by Corporal Nacion, not Dimalanta, on the basis that Nacion outranked Dimalanta, and the information was more likely to be received without immediate dismissal if it came from an NCO. Bautista listened without expression. He walked to the eastern slope, found the tunnel entrance, which Dimalanta had sealed with a bamboo plug as a precaution against discovery, and had Dimalanta reopen it so he could look inside. He did not enter. He stood at the entrance and looked down the tunnel's length for a long time without speaking. Then he turned around and walked back uphill. No formal commendation was issued. No entry was made in the official unit log acknowledging what Dimalanta had done, though the incident log held at the National Historical Commission contains a terse notation, dated March 14, 1942, that reads, "Eastern slope contact repelled pre-dawn. No unit casualties. Japanese element estimated at 40+ withdrew with casualties. Method improvised." The word improvised is underlined in a different hand than the rest of the notation. No one knows who underlined it. What changed was quieter and more consequential than any official commendation. Within 2 days of March 14, Dimalanta had been formally relieved of his conventional fighting position and assigned, by Bautista's explicit order, to terrain preparation duties, a category that had not existed before and was created specifically to authorize what Dimalanta was already doing. 3 other soldiers were detailed to assist him. By March 18, there were 2 additional tunnel systems on Hill 522, and Dimalanta was consulting informally with a sergeant from an adjacent unit who had heard about the March 14 action and wanted to know how the tunnels were constructed. Bautista never apologized for confiscating the weapon. Dimalanta never asked him to. What happened instead was the more practical adjustment. When Dimalanta brought the redesigned 3rd version of his bellows weapon to Bautista's attention, Bautista looked at it, handed it back, and said, "Don't lose it." That was the entirety of the institutional reversal. In Bataan in March 1942 it was sufficient. The legend spread laterally through the Filipino defensive lines in the way that genuinely extraordinary things spread among soldiers under pressure, not through official channels, not through briefings, but through the informal network of NCOs and runners, and men who happened to be present when a story was told around a fire after dark. The detail that most captured the imagination of the men who heard it was not the weapon itself but the tunnel. The fact that a Filipino private had spent 5 weeks digging a hole that the enemy didn't know existed, and then fought the entire battle from inside the earth. "Lumaban siya mula sa lupa," men said to each other. He fought from the ground, in a campaign defined by retreat and diminishing resources. That image of a man who had nothing and used the earth itself as his weapon carried a specific emotional charge that formal accounts of tactical success could not replicate. The Bataan Death March began on April 9, 1942, 3 weeks and 4 days after the morning Dimalanta emerged from his tunnel. He survived it, though the record of his survival is fragmentary. He appears in a 1945 prisoner of war repatriation list compiled by the Philippine Army, alive and present for liberation. He appears in a 1963 Veterans Affairs oral history interview, recorded in his home province of Pampanga, describing the tunnel construction in the patient technical detail of a man who has thought about the specifics of a problem for 20 years and wants to be certain the questioner understands exactly how it was done. Aurelio Dimalanta returned to Lubao after the war. He went back to farming. He did not seek recognition in any formal sense. He appears to have been temperamentally unsuited to the seeking of recognition, which may be precisely what made him effective in the situations where recognition was the last thing on his mind. The bamboo bellows weapon was not preserved. It was left in the tunnel on Hill 522 when the Bataan defenders were ordered to surrender, and if it still lies there beneath the grass and laterite, it has never been found. What remains is the account, a private soldier, dismissed and overruled, who spent 5 weeks building something that no one believed in the dark, under a hill that everyone else was defending conventionally, and who on a cold, foggy morning in March 1942 proved that the most dangerous place on a battlefield can be below it. His technique was not taught in any military academy. It drew on no textbook, no manual, no training received from any institution. It drew on 24 years of living close to the ground, on a childhood spent learning how soil moved and how sound traveled through it, on a quality of patient observational attention that the Philippine Army's rank structure had no category for, and therefore no way to value. In 1963, the interviewing officer from the Veterans Affairs Office asked Dimolanta what he remembered most about the morning of March 14. Dimolanta thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "The sound of them leaving. When you hear 40 men start running away from you in the dark, you know the thing you built worked." The interviewing officer wrote this down. Beside it, he noted, subject appeared calm, showed no particular pride. That restraint is perhaps the final element of the record. The man who dug his way into legend and emerged from it without ceremony, who fought from the ground and returned to the ground when the war was done, and who spent the rest of his life in the province where he was born, farming the same soil he had once turned into a weapon. No one ever doubted him again.